It's an honor to be doing. Mira and I are lifelong friends with true love of our parents knowing each other and having loved one another. My huge love of her father Ilya's work and her mother's work, especially the late mezuzahs that you all got to know and know me, her sister. And basically, we also have our Provincetown connection, which is our entire life, mainly on the beach. But we have our art connection too, and I'm honored that you're here and to have a book launch.
Well, thank you so much. And when Mimi invited me to do this here, it just seemed like the most perfect solution in that we do have this lifelong friendship and friendship in art. And indeed, many a Scrabble game on the beach with Renee, Mimi's mother.
Master of the Scrabble.
Yeah. And Chaim was an amazing force in the American art world, and certainly in Provincetown he was a very distinctive figure, and I always loved coming to their homes and loved their incredible art collections and collections with so many things that were a fascination to me as a child, including their collection of Life magazines, which I think had the biggest influence going back to the 40s. And Chaim lived long enough to actually defend me vigorously in his old age when I was doing work that was sort of challenging. He was waving his cane at some old blowhard, and I was very grateful to him. So anyway, I'm so pleased that we could do this here, and I was trying to think of what to say about the book. I'm not going to read from it, but I thought, well, first of all, this morning I thought, okay, the God of Weather said, what was the name of that book? Negative Thinking.
Was that a black cloud? We'll throw in a black cloud.
It goes with wet. Yes, it was the wrong weather for the stand there. Okay, that makes it right. And so I thought maybe I would talk a little bit about the title of the book, just to how did I get to that title. Just the way Wet was actually a very last minute selection of a title, speaking to a friend on the phone and finally saying, oh, why don't we just call it Wet? Why don't I just call it Wet? In the same way, my dear friend Susanna Heller, who's trying to take pictures, I had a number of other titles, and the last sort of working title was Pre-Existing Non-Conforming, which relates to, it's actually a term in Provincetown. In Provincetown, people would just like build sort of be a fish hut, and then they might stick a kitchen on it, and then they'd put a kitchen, and then they'd stick a bathroom, and there was like absolutely no code involved with how anything was built. And of course, these houses still exist, and they are called pre-existing non-conforming structures. And I felt like that was me, that I was a pre-existing non-conforming structure. But my editor hated that title, and the readers hated that title, so I had to come up with something else. So Susanna and I had this long conversation on the phone, and finally I just said, oh, well, yeah, why don't I just call it A Decade of Negative Thinking? And we thought, like, that's it, that's perfect. But then, as I discuss in my introduction, that brings up the notion of, am I a negative thinker? Which there are times where I'm not the most optimistic person. I tend to see the dark side. At the same time as I'm working my butt off in a positive way. And but the two ways in which the number of ways in which I think that the title occurred was I tend to see things in the art world, and then I don't see people responding to them in the critical way that I think that they ought to. So, for example, there's an essay in the book called Like a Veneer, which comes from Lisa Yuskavich saying that her work is like Vermeer. And it's something that she was telling people. And I'm very interested in the way in which art history is produced through those little building blocks of what artists say about their work, and that enters into reviews, and then it enters into art history. And they're often preposterous in that case. So that's sort of, I feel the necessity to intervene into that. If that seems negative, so be it. On the other hand, I also was thinking that it was a very negative decade in terms of American history, the history of the world, and just for some of us. and that had certain interactions. The art world does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a real, social structure. We're living in New York, in the United States, so I think that when I'm talking about negative thinkers, or I'm also thinking about Cheney and Bush and their negative thinking. So I'm not necessarily a negative thinker. On the other hand, I also it also brings up the whole idea of sort of critical theory, negative thinking. I'm not the most dogmatic Frankfurt School critic by any means, but I probably have inherited some of the ideas about resistance that type of philosophy has, and so that goes into it. So that's it. And